You stir from slumber, stretching out tired muscles that have been under constant punishment the last few days. When the Loremaster mentioned training, you had not expected the intense regimen he enforced without mercy. Each day had been split into 3 tasks that you now performed religiously: maintaining and harvesting the garden in the morning, combat training and physical exercise during the day, followed by magical instruction at dusk. For 2 weeks, you had been hard at work in these trials, learning swiftly thanks to the Loremaster's effective but painful lessons. Oftentimes, you could not help but start to wonder about him, thinking that perhaps his curious life of adventure and knowledge-seeking had begun to result in some form of madness. Just how old was he anyway? The more you learned about the world's geography, and the many routes by which one may travel it, the more you realized that for his stories to be true, the Loremaster must be far more ancient than he appears. How did he manage to maintain his youthful vigor despite the relentless passing of time? He seemed human, but so did many champions of the dark gods and undead horrors. Perhaps if you continue to gather information through his stories, his teachings, you may be able to figure out just where your mysterious lord draws his power from. You recall that the Loremaster had promised to grant you the choice of what monsters to learn of over the next few weeks, by allowing you to select from a list he left in your room. Perhaps by asking about some of the most terrifying creatures in various lands, you may discover just what your teacher is from his tales. Ah, good evening, my young lore-seeker. To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit this long night? You have decided upon the first exotic beast you wish to learn about. Very well. Then tell me, which of the world's nightmares have you chosen? Ah, the Preyton. An excellent choice. Take a seat then, my dear student, and allow me to regale you about the embodiment of hate that stalks the dark forests of Bretonnia. In the lands of chivalry, there are several places where nightmarish things gather. The damned city of Musion, the deadly slopes of Massif Orkel, and most sinister of all, the forest of Arden. That terrible wood is home to a truly staggering number of fierce monsters and horrid creatures. For legend tells that in some past age, the land itself was corrupted by a great evil. Likely the work of the Gave spawn. But that is a tale for another time. Now, of course, there are many hallowed grounds within that place, thanks to the efforts of the Azrai. But most of the forest remains dark and twisted. I happened to be passing through a hamlet in the kingdom of Artois, where the peasantry were discussing how a great many knights had never returned after entering the forest of Arden on some hunt. Normally, I would have ignored such inane chatter, but then those filthy workhorses made mention that the Fae had been sighted in the area. With my interest piqued, I journeyed close to the border of the wood, where after a bit of effort, I successfully located a kin band of wood elves. Though it took a fair bit of hassle to earn their reluctant trust, the Azrai eventually allowed me to accompany them into the forest in search of their quarry. Apparently, the Bretonians were not the only ones to have lost brave warriors to some mysterious predator. Following secret paths known to few outside of the Wood Elves, we penetrated the forest of Arden and hunted for the bloodthirsty monster lurking somewhere within. Likely unaware that I had long since mastered the language of Eltherin, My guides spoke among themselves about what they suspected our prey to be. The youngest of the scouts, all easily below a century in age by my guess, kept guessing titanic beasts, such as the ravenous Gorgon or the cyclopean Cygor. While certainly capable of claiming of the lives lost thus far, such monsters would have been far more noticeable, and undoubtedly would have long since stumbled out of the tree line in a blind rampage. The more seasoned archers suggested that instead the culprit was a Jabberslythe, that horrid nightmare-made flesh that embodies the insanity of chaos. Certainly a distinct possibility, as the Jabberslythe is more than capable of annihilating entire armies who enter their territory by causing rampant lunacy, former brothers-in-arms attacking one another in the berserk frenzy of utter madness. Yet I knew this too to be inaccurate, as while such a monster is of course quite deadly, they are awkward creatures who are unable to prevent most of their prey from escaping. The survivors scattering in all directions to flee the source of their terror, their broken minds eventually recovering enough to seek out the safety of civilization. Yet none had returned from the forest of Arden in the last few weeks from what I heard. I had my own suspicions about the beast responsible as we pressed further beneath the twisted canopy, sharing a dark glance with the Azrai's captain when the air began to reek with the distinct odor of blood. Although I never had the opportunity to ask her, I suspect the Glade captain managed to guess what we would be facing. The stench continued to swell with each step we took deeper into the forest. My concern deepened when at last we entered the hunting grounds of our quarry. It was a charnel house. Torn chunks of flesh and ravaged armor hung from gnarled branches, while assorted gore littered across the blood-stained soil. Even the forest had not been spared, the vegetation befouled and trampled by the rampaging horror that claimed this region as its lair. Deep as we were within the forest of Arden, it had become difficult to tell the difference between night and day, as the shadows oppressively blotted out all forms of light. Just as my guide started to fan out in search of clues for our mysterious predator, a peculiar sound came just off from the left. The wood elves identified the source quicker than I, as to them, it was an unfortunately familiar cry. A gravely wounded great stag, bleating in agony, as it likely had been mauled by our unknown monster. Half of the Azrai vaulted to the aid of the majestic beast, hoping to save the creature if possible. To the elves of Athel-Loren, the great stags are considered the most noble and blessed of all the forest's creatures. I could make out the impressive set of antlers just beyond a tangled mess of thorned vines, though the deep shadows made it difficult to identify even that much. Swift as they are, the elves managed to close the distance in a heartbeat, halting only when their captain shouted for them to flee. To hear such blatant terror in the voice of an elf shocked me for a moment, before I realized that we had found our monster. If only the noble-hearted wood elves had been so quick. The mewling cry suddenly devolved into an enraged shriek as the wounded great stag tore forward, exploding through the vines to reveal we had been deceived. What emerged from the brambles was no natural creature, but an abomination of chaos. What had once been a glorious rack of antlers were now blackened, serrated horns, covered with the tattered remains of those who had come before. Swollen to monstrous proportions by the corruption coursing through its veins, the monster had grown far larger than even the mightiest of great stags, and sported rife mutation across its muscular body. The creature's hide was torn and mutilated, its fur hanging lank, and in many places sloughing away to be replaced by filth-encrusted scales or exotic feathers. Most notable were the chimeric elements of the beast, as its hind quarters were that of some leonine horror, with immense clawed paws and a lashing tail. Sprouting horrid leathery wings from its hooved forelegs, the twisted king of the forest moved uncannily fast as it launched towards the elves. The once noble bearing of a stag's head, distorted by glowing eyes full of pitiless malice, and jaws full of row upon row of razored fangs. We had been lured in by a Preyton. Caught off guard by the beast's ambush, the Azray warriors had no time to react, as the twisted monster tore into them. Several elves were impaled upon the serrated horns, another screaming as sharp teeth shredded his flesh. Iron-hard hooves lashed out to shatter bones and crush skulls, the Preyton's tail sweeping out to knock the remaining wood elves prone. I could only watch in stunned silence as the twisted fiend's insane bloodlust drove it into a frenzy, tearing at the elves until their bodies were unrecognizable. Before I could rally my courage, the remaining Azrai blurred past me in a vain attempt to save their comrades, lashing out with spear and sword. I tried to call them back, warn them that engaging a Preyton in combat without overwhelming odds was total madness. Many of their attacks were turned aside by the Chaos Beast's tough hide or mutated scales, but the odd strike managed to wound the horror. But instead of shrieking back in pain, the Preyton shuddered with satisfaction as it bled, becoming emboldened by the consuming hatred it held even for itself. You see, these devils are filled with such incredible self-loathing that they relish their own pain. I suspect longing for death on some instinctual level. Unfortunately, that knowledge provides little comfort when watching an entire kin band torn to pieces by the freakish speed and surprising skill with which the twisted stag beast unleashed its hate. Soon the entire area had been drenched in fresh gore, as the Preyton flailed around, rending and tearing at the fallen, with a zealotry for slaughter that would make bloodletters blush. The Glade Captain appeared beside me, tears streaming down her face to have witnessed the ruinous fate of her kin. I grabbed her by the shoulder and whispered that we should flee while the monstrosity was distracted by its endless malice for all things. We ran for a solid distance before I noticed that the sound of her careful footsteps had ceased. Normally, I try not to concern myself with the lives of others, as in my business, as you will learn, it is an unhealthy habit to get attached to others. Yet, I could not help myself, and turned, looking for my last surviving companion. She had climbed up some twisted excuse for an ancient oak, kneeling upon one of its largest branches, and taking careful aim with an arrow. I shouted for her to stop, even if she could land a flawless shot at the rampaging beast, the odds of it retreating or dying were virtually nil. She responded in Eltherin that she knew my responsibilities, and that I should know hers. She knew of me, and was invoking laws set into stone long ago. Scowling, I stood my ground to at least witness her efforts. With one final deep breath, she released her bow, and the arrow vanished in a blur towards our foe. I heard an impact of enchanted missile into corrupted flesh, and all fell silent. The Glade captain slowly lowered her bow and turned to meet my gaze, those strange alien eyes telling me such a tale. She gave me a sad smile, just as the Preyton exploded out from the branches in mid-flight, bellowing in hatred as it impaled her with those nightmarish antlers. With an arrow protruding from its left eye, the shrieking beast shook its head violently and cast the elf's corpse to the ground before descending upon it. At that point, I turned and left, knowing the creature was far too occupied with shredding apart its foe, thanks to a malice I could never even imagine. The sound of tearing flesh and cracking bones followed me as I departed the forest of Arden. The Preyton is a tragic creature, despite its bloodthirsty hatred for all things that dare move. As I imagine you deduced by now, they were once the kingly forest spirits known as great stags, easily the most revered animal by the wood elves, though to call them an animal is borderline insulting, as they are far more. This likely explains why the beastmen went to such great efforts long ago to create this perverse species, capturing great stags and utilizing a dark ritual among sacrifice-strewn herdstones to corrupt them into horrid monsters. To take such a majestic creature and strip away all that made them noble was cruel indeed. It drove them to hate all that reminds the Preyton of what it once was, making them powerful enemies against that which is good and pure. Thankfully, these beasts are quite rare, as they do not appear to breed, and thus new ones are only created by that profane ritual I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, this does indicate that the chimeric predators are immortal, unless slain in battle, forced to suffer their all-consuming hatred against themselves and everything else until the sweet release of death. Should you ever encounter a Preyton, I would highly encourage you to get out into the open as quickly as possible. They are incredibly skilled ambush predators, specializing in utilizing woodland terrain to their advantage, and luring in foes to tear apart. Should you be able to escape to a more favorable battlefield, do what you can to slay the monster at range. Cannons should do the trick, though they can be difficult targets, as Preytons are frighteningly fast both in the air and on the ground. That concludes my tale on the Preyton. I trust you now appreciate the terrible nature of that twisted fiend. Those poor creatures truly are out of their minds. Could you just imagine it? Your body being distorted by the powers of chaos until it has stripped away all that you loved about yourself, and leaving behind only that which you hate, exaggerated to horrific degree. Truly a terrible fate for any soul, much less one so proud as the great stag. I have heard whispered rumors that there is one among the beastmen who seeks to create more of these horrors, perhaps even trying to further the ritual so it can work on other forms of life. The Crow Father has ever sought to please the dark gods, I suppose. We can only hope that he does not succeed. Hey guys, sorry that this episode was rather late in being released. I managed to get a hell of a queasy stomach yesterday, and whoo boy, that knocked my ass out of commission for a good solid day. But hey, we got finished, and I hope you all enjoyed this video featuring the highly requested Preyton. If you did, please hit that like button to show your appreciation, as it helps me out quite a bit. Also, if you'd like to share the Monstrous Arcanum series so far with any friends or communities you think may enjoy it, please do. There's even a handy playlist on the channel that has all the episodes compiled. I would like to take a quick moment to thank my patrons for all their support. I really appreciate your faith in what I do. Finally, a special shout out to the Big Seven themselves: CJ Ubusta, Sign of the Emperor, Wendell Short Eyes, Eric, Jeffrey Ramers, Charles Bode, and Higgins the Seagull. I really appreciate all of you watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.